When we think of Vikings, we picture warriors, long ships, blades and blood, and burning villages. But that's only half the story. The real fight wasn't out there, on distant shores. It was right here, in the soil, under frostbitten skies, against time, hunger, and the cold. Because survival wasn't about glory. It was about food. Food. Not the grand feast sung by skalds, but the humble roots pulled from frozen earth. The bitter greens that staved off scurvy. The wild herbs that healed more wounds than any blade ever could. Today, we've forgotten them, but for the Vikings, these plants meant life or death. So if you think history is only written in battlefields, think again. This is the story of the crops that fed a civilization, the superfoods that vanished, and the wisdom that just might save us. Again. Before steel ever met flesh, before sails caught wind and long ships cut through northern fog, there was a plant. Not a weapon, not a treasure, but a stalk, tall, fragrant, hollow. Angelica, the green lifeline growing quietly in Viking gardens, waiting in the background of history. It never made it into sagas, never earned a runestone, never spilled blood. But without it, many of those stories might have ended before they began. You see, to be a Viking wasn't just to fight, it was to survive, through winters so long and brutal that even the sun seemed to vanish in fear, through sea voyages that tested the lungs, the stomach, the soul. And in those moments, it wasn't strength or steel that saved them. It was plants like Angelica. The Vikings didn't stumble upon this plant by chance. They understood it, respected it, cultivated it. Angelica Archangelica, a name that whispers of divinity. Legend says it was revealed to man by the archangel Raphael himself, a gift to fight off the plague. And while that tale likely arrived with Christian influence long after the gods of Asgard were worshipped in hushed tones, the truth is just as remarkable. Angelica saved lives, again and again. Imagine a garden in the Scandinavian wilderness, soil frozen half the year, winds sharp enough to carve bone. Yet there it stood, a towering green sentinel, nearly 6 feet tall, with feathered leaves and pale umbels blooming like a crown. Angelica didn't just grow in the north, it thrived there. And so did the Vikings who understood its power. In the long winter months, when fresh fruits were only memories and the threat of scurvy crept in through every cough and aching joint, Angelica offered a simple solution: vitamin C, in abundance. The stalks, crunchy, celery-like, almost sweet, were eaten raw or preserved in honey. The roots, potent and earthy, were steeped in ale to create medicinal brews. The leaves, aromatic and slightly bitter, seasoned stews and soups, giving not just flavor but healing. Even the seeds had their place, gathered, dried, and sometimes used in spirit making or medicine. This was no ordinary herb. This was the Viking multivitamin. During sea voyages, when the ocean stretched endlessly and salt spray burned the face, warriors would chew on Angelica stems like lifelines. Not for pleasure, but for survival. Think of that. Hardened men, seasoned in blood and conquest, quietly chewing fragrant stalks like children gnawing on straws, because they knew instinctively that their strength began not in the arm, but in the gut. Angelica was not glamorous. It wasn't exotic. It didn't come from distant lands like saffron or cinnamon. It wasn't a spice of kings. But it worked. And when you're staring down a Nordic winter or the endless gray of an open sea, what works is sacred. Archaeologists have found Angelica seeds at Viking settlements across Scandinavia, from small farms in Iceland to larger trade centers like Birka and Hedeby. Its presence wasn't incidental, it was intentional. These weren't scattered weeds. They were cultivated, harvested, preserved. The Vikings understood something modern society has forgotten. Medicine and food were not separate things. The kitchen was the pharmacy, the garden was the defense. And Angelica, with its antiviral, antibacterial, and anti-inflammatory properties, was an entire health system wrapped into one humble plant. But where is it now? Go into a modern supermarket and you won't find Angelica. Ask most people, and they've never heard of it. A few specialty distilleries in Scandinavia still use it in spirits like aquavit. Some heritage gardeners grow it for its beauty. But as a staple, as survival, it's gone, replaced by synthetic vitamins, forgotten in favor of convenience, pushed aside by agriculture that favors speed over resilience, yield over wisdom. Angelica takes 2 years to mature. It's sensitive. It requires care. It doesn't lend itself well to mechanical farming or plastic packaging. And so, like many other ancient plants, it vanished, not because it failed us, but because we failed it. But here's the deeper truth. In forgetting Angelica, we haven't just lost a vegetable. We've lost a connection, a link to a time when people knew every root by name, when survival meant understanding what the land offered, not what could be bought on shelves. A time when warriors knew that before you lift your sword, you'd better feed your soul. And maybe that's what Angelica reminds us of now. Not just the fragility of tradition, but the depth of it. That real strength isn't in dominance, but in relationship with the earth, with the seasons, with the plants that ask nothing but space and care, and in return, offer life. The next time you see a weed growing tall and wild in the wind, pause. It may not be worthless, it may be Angelica, or something like it, waiting to be remembered. Just like the warriors who once carried it, not on their shields, but in their teeth. Not for glory, but to live another day. Not all heroes rise above the earth. Some stay buried, quietly enduring, silently saving lives. In the Viking world, there was such a hero. It wasn't forged in fire. It wasn't sung about in mead halls. It grew underfoot, Navu, a name nearly lost to time, a root that doesn't inspire awe, not at first glance. No vibrant color, no intoxicating aroma, just a gnarled, pale thing pulled from the dirt. But ask any Norse farmer from 1200 years ago what kept their families alive when the snow sealed their doors and their fields were frozen solid, and they'd say this name with reverence. Navu was life insurance, hidden underground. Long before the modern turnip, rutabaga, or rapeseed, there was Navu, the grandfather of root crops. In today's world, we obsess over food that's flashy. We chase the rare, the colorful, the sweet. But for the Vikings, food wasn't fashion. It was function. And Navu? It functioned better than almost anything else in the Norse pantry. It grew in poor soil. It thrived in cold summers. And when everything else failed, when grain harvests fell short, when fish didn't return to shore, Navu was still there, waiting patiently beneath the frost. You could store it through winter in cool, dry rooms, or, in coastal areas with milder winters, leave it in the ground like a buried treasure chest. Come January, when the wind howled like Fenrir through the mountains, a Viking could walk outside, dig through frozen mud, and still eat. That's not farming. That's foresight. Archaeologists have found carbonized Navu seeds in Viking settlements from the 8th century onward, seeds blackened by time but never by neglect. These weren't weeds. They were chosen, planted, tended. The Norse had no chemical fertilizers, but they knew the land. They planted Navu in raised beds to protect it from floods, to let it breathe. They rotated crops even without modern science, understanding that the earth gives, but only if you don't ask it for the same gift over and over. After Navu depleted the soil, they let it rest, or they followed it with nitrogen-fixing plants. A system, a rhythm, a balance. Navu wasn't just a crop. It was a partnership, and every part of it mattered. The root, rich in carbohydrates, gave energy. The leaves, bitter but bursting with minerals, kept scurvy and sickness at bay during the hungry months. Those weeks in late winter and early spring when supplies ran out, but new food hadn't yet come. Root to leaf, nothing wasted. That's not survival, that's discipline. And the taste? Strong, sometimes sharp. But that wasn't a flaw. It was flavor born of purpose, a signal from the plant that it meant business. In Viking kitchens, Navu roots were boiled into thick, hearty stews, mashed with herbs like juniper and thyme, aromas that warmed the spirit even before the food hit the tongue. The greens were cooked down like spinach or mixed with other foraged leaves. In lean years, they were dried, stored, saved. But perhaps the most forward-thinking use of Navu was fermentation. Vikings were masters of this lost art. They turned simple root vegetables into preserved probiotic gold, a kind of ancient sauerkraut that strengthened the gut, this preserved vitamins, and kept food safe for months. Long before kombucha became a wellness fad, long before anyone used the word microbiome, Viking families were feeding their children fermented turnip roots and unknowingly building stronger bodies from the inside out. Let that sink in. In an age with no refrigeration, no supermarkets, no multivitamins, they created a food system that worked with nature. They didn't control the land. They collaborated with it. So why did this plant, so resilient, so essential, disappear? The answer, as always, lies in the march of progress. As agriculture industrialized, we wanted crops that looked uniform. That fit neatly into crates that could be harvested by machines. Neve, with its irregular shape and slower growth, didn't make the cut. Its taste, once valued for its boldness, was labeled too bitter for modern palates. Its roots were too long, its leaves too wild, its presence too ancient, and so it faded, replaced by smoother, sweeter cousins, erased from cookbooks, lost from memory. But beneath that loss lies something deeper, a warning. In our race toward convenience, we've sacrificed diversity. We've turned our backs on the plants that fed us when the world was cruel. Nevu didn't just survive the cold, it defied it. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was there when it mattered most, just like the mothers who boiled it late into the night, the farmers who knelt in mud to harvest it, the children who grew strong on its bitter leaves and sweet roasted flesh. This is more than a forgotten vegetable, it's a lost chapter of human resilience. So the next time you walk through a produce aisle, think about this. Somewhere beneath our feet, there are seeds. Seeds of survival. Seeds of memory. Seeds like Nevu, waiting for someone to remember them. Not because they're trendy, not because they're marketable, but because one day when the storms return, we might need them again. In the saga of survival, some plants are like warriors, bold, visible, celebrated. Others are like shadows. Scurwhite was one of those shadows, a root that never sought attention, a plant that asked for little, yet gave everything. You've likely never heard of it. Most haven't. Even food historians, with their libraries of forgotten flavors, often pass it by. But the Vikings didn't. They knew scurwhite. They planted it in quiet corners of their gardens, in the thin soils between stones, on windswept hills where other crops refused to grow. Because when the world went cold and hungry, scurwhite never failed them. To modern eyes, it looks unassuming. Delicate fern-like foliage above, long, pale root below. It resembles a parsnip's wild cousin, but it speaks the language of survival in a tone we've forgotten how to hear. And what a survivor it was. Where wheat withered and barley bent, scurwhite stood tall. It thrived in rocky, nutrient-poor ground, the kind of land modern agriculture deems useless. But to a Viking farmer, that patch of land meant one more meal. It was a perennial. You didn't have to sow it every year. You planted it once, and it came back season after season with little care, like a silent promise kept. That alone made it invaluable. But it was what scurwhite did for the body that made it sacred. Its roots were rich in starches and oils, warming, sustaining. But they also carried compounds we now know to be anti-inflammatory and antibacterial. The Vikings didn't know the science. They didn't need to. They knew that those who ate scurwhite fell ill less often, that it soothed the stomach, cleared the chest, warmed the limbs. In the depth of winter, when darkness stretched for weeks and the cold crept through bone and breath, scurwhite was brewed into tonics. The roots were dried, ground, steeped in ale or hot water. Taken before sleep or before journey, a medicine disguised as a meal. This wasn't luxury. This was strategy. In Norse households, scurwhite was roasted in hearth embers, boiled in stews with wild herbs, or even ground into a fine powder to enrich porridge, that humble daily dish that carried families from one season to the next. And though the flavor was strange, a swirling mix of parsley, earth, and a faint licorice, it was distinct. It was recognizable. It was the taste of security. Some scholars believe that scurwhite was even carried on long sea voyages. Dried, lightweight, and packed with resilience, it served as both food and remedy, an ancient version of a survival ration. Picture it, warriors setting sail into the unknown with axes on their belts and a bundle of roots in their satchels, one for strength, one for sickness, one for the days when salt fish and flatbread could no longer fill the soul. But despite all this, scurwhite didn't make it. As time passed and trade routes grew, more productive crops like potatoes arrived. Crops that yielded more, looked cleaner, cooked faster, sold better. Scurwhite, slow to grow, odd in taste, tough to tame, fell behind. Not because it failed us, but because we outpaced it, or so we thought. Today, scurwhite exists mostly in botanical gardens. In remote corners of Scotland or Norway, it sometimes clings to rocky soil, remembered only by folk traditions and the occasional herbalist. But to the Vikings, it was essential, because food, to them, was never just about calories. It was about endurance. It was about outlasting the dark with whatever the land could offer. And scurwhite was one of those quiet offerings, a root that asked nothing but patience, a reminder that not all strength is loud, that not all nourishment grows in fertile valleys, that sometimes the most reliable things grow where they shouldn't, thrive where they're told not to, and give everything without asking to be seen. Scurwhite isn't trending on social media, it's not in your grocery aisle, but maybe it should be. Because as climate shifts and soil erodes, as we search for foods that can survive the hard seasons ahead, perhaps it's time we remember the root that already did. Not for fashion, not for fame, but for those long winters when warmth doesn't come from the sun, but from what we've buried carefully beneath the earth. Just like the ancestors who once trusted a root more than they trusted the weather. Some plants ask for space, some demand your care, your sweat, your prayer, but Fat Hen asked for none of it. It simply arrived. And in doing so, it saved lives. Today, we call it a weed, a nuisance, a garden invader. But to the Vikings, it was a gift. In the short growing season of the North, time was precious. The window between frost and famine was narrow. Every edible green mattered. And there, thriving in disturbed soil between grain rows and near compost piles, grew a plant with diamond-shaped leaves, pale undersides, and a strange, dusty sheen. Chenopodium album. The Norse knew it well, though we'll never know what they called it. We know this: they didn't pull it, they harvested it. Archaeological digs at Norse settlements, from the English city of Jorvik to outposts in Denmark, have unearthed fat hen seeds carefully stored with barley and rye. Not discarded, not accidental. Preserved, protected, planted. Because fat hen wasn't just tolerated, it was cultivated. This unassuming plant was among the first to rise from winter's grave. It emerged as the snow melted, bringing with it green, and with green, life. In a world where vitamin C was scarce, where hunger didn't ask for permission, Fat Hen stood up like an old friend, waving its dusty leaves in the wind. Young leaves were picked and boiled like spinach. They were mixed into thick stews, added to barley porridge, or eaten fresh by children who hadn't tasted green in months. Its taste? Mild, mealy. But its impact? Monumental. It carried more iron than cabbage, more calcium and B1 than spinach. And in the late winter, when preserved foods ran low and the body began to weaken, Fat Hen was like a silent medicine cabinet rooted in the soil. And it didn't stop at greens. The seeds, tiny, black, abundant, were collected and ground into flour, added to bread, boosted nutrition. In some Viking communities, these seeds were even fermented, turned into a mild herbal beer, a probiotic tonic long before the word existed. It was food, it was medicine, it was resilience in a single stem, and yet, we forgot. Somewhere along the way, Fat Hen became unwelcome. As commercial farming took hold, as monoculture swept across our fields, plants like this, wild, unpredictable, too generous, were pushed out. It didn't conform, it didn't fit neat rows. It grew too easily, too freely, and so we declared war on it. Herbicides erased its legacy. Gardeners pulled it with pride. Its name was written on how to eliminate lists, not on menus. The plant that once helped Vikings survive countless brutal springs is now seen as a pest. But maybe the problem wasn't with the plant. Maybe the problem was with us. We stopped listening. We forgot that the earth gives freely, not always beautifully, not always conveniently, but generously. Fat Hen didn't require pampering. It asked for nothing except that we notice it. It thrived in forgotten corners, grew between bricks, in pathways, beside barns. It grew wherever we had left a scar, and in return, it healed. Maybe that's what makes its story so haunting, because in pulling it from the earth, we didn't just uproot a weed, we uprooted wisdom. The Vikings knew that food security wasn't about control, it was about awareness. Not every crop needs to be imported. Not every answer comes from the market. Sometimes the solution is already growing, quietly, humbly, waiting for us to remember. And so, the next time you kneel in your garden, look closer. That weed you're about to tear out, it might be Fat Hen. The same plant that once fed Viking children through spring. The same plant that kept warriors strong when meat ran out. And the same plant that may one day remind us how to live with the land again, before we forget too much. Before we lose the last green whispers of the past beneath concrete and chemicals, before the gifts of the earth give up on us. Where land met sea, in the crashing tides and salted winds of the Norse coastline, the Vikings found treasure, not gold, not silver, but a plant, one that clung to the rocks like it had something to prove. Sea kale. In the most unforgiving spaces, windswept beaches, salt-sprayed dunes, cliffs where little else could grow, this hardy perennial rose from the sand, waxy leaves flared like armor, its roots dug deep into shifting, treacherous earth. And the Vikings? They didn't just find it, they relied on it. Sea kale was more than food. It was a symbol of Norse adaptability, the ability to look at a barren landscape and see a harvest. Most civilizations turned away from salt marshes, called them useless. But the Vikings leaned in. They looked at the crashing waves, the briny soil, and asked a different question: what grows here? And sea kale answered. Thick, ruffled leaves, sometimes tinged purple in spring, were harvested while young and tender, cooked like asparagus. The mature greens, boiled like cabbage or chopped into hearty fish stews. Even the thick midribs of the leaves, what most would discard, were eaten like broccoli stems, boiled or roasted. Every part mattered. Because when you live on the edge of the world, nothing is wasted. Its taste was bold, earthy, a little salty, but behind the flavor was something more important: nutrition. Sea kale was packed with vitamin C, one of the few defenses against scurvy during the long winters when fruit was a myth. It also held iodine, essential for thyroid health, something missing from most inland diets. And for Viking communities on the coasts, sea kale was insurance. It grew where fields couldn't be plowed. It asked for no fence, no fertilizer, no field. It simply appeared right on the beach, just beyond the reach of the high tide. And the Vikings, never ones to let a good thing slip away, practiced wild management. They protected patches of sea kale, scattered seeds, even developed a method of covering the plants with pebbles or sand in late winter to force early blanched shoots, tender, pale, and rich in life-saving nutrients. It was their version of gardening, done with observation, not domination. But sea kale didn't just nourish, it lasted. When fresh food was long gone, Vikings fermented sea kale, just like they did with other brassicas. In clay vessels, packed with salt and herbs, it became a kind of Viking sauerkraut, a living food that carried them through the dead of winter. And here's the most remarkable part. In coastal excavation sites, archaeologists have found pottery with traces of fermented sea kale, proof that this wasn't theory, it was practice, a food tradition that bridged the gap between hunger and spring. So what happened? Why did this resilient, nourishing plant, perfectly adapted to its landscape, vanish? The answer, once again, is progress. In the post-medieval period, as coastlines were developed and drained, wild sea kale was overharvested. As cities grew, the sandy habitats it needed were paved over, built on, fenced in, and in kitchens, its flavor was declared too strong, too strange. In the age of sugar and starch, sea kale was deemed a relic. By the 18th century, it had become a luxury vegetable in Europe, grown under pots, sold at premium prices in fancy gardens, but far removed from its original humble role as a coastal lifeline. Today, sea kale survives mostly as an ornamental curiosity, a beautiful but misunderstood plant in a botanical garden. But the truth is, sea kale wasn't meant to be caged in flower beds. It was meant to be found, on the edges, where the tide threatens, where the earth gives only to those who truly look. Because the Vikings didn't just survive in harsh places, they listened to them. They knew that if something could grow in a place like that, wild, salty, brutal, it was worth learning from. Sea kale is a reminder of that ancient relationship between food and place, between patience and reward, between a people who didn't ask the world to bend and a world that fed them anyway. So the next time you walk by a rocky shoreline, look closer. That rugged plant clinging to life in the sand, it might be sea kale, the beach cabbage that once held the line between nourishment and starvation. A plant that didn't need perfect soil because it had perfect purpose. It didn't grow in fields, it didn't bloom in lush gardens or fertile valleys. It grew in stone, in cracks, in corners, in places where nothing else dared. Or pine. You may know it today as a decorative succulent, something to fill a pot or a patch of rooftop green. But to the Vikings, it was far more than that. It was insurance. In the harshest parts of the Norse world, where rocky soil offered more defiance than nourishment, where dry summers cracked the earth like old leather, Orpine endured. With thick, fleshy leaves arranged in rosettes, it stored water like a secret, a living reservoir tucked into the stone walls and roof lines of Viking homes. Yes, Homes. The Vikings didn't just grow orpine in gardens, they grew it on the roofs. Sod roof homes were insulated with layers of earth and grass, but in some regions of Scandinavia, orpine was planted there too, adding not only food and medicine, but moisture retention and lightning protection. A plant that helped hold the house together and fed the people. That's not gardening, that's integration. This wasn't a crop you tended like barley or rye. Orpine was a quiet companion. It asked for no care. It grew where others gave up. And when drought hit, when rains didn't come, when more delicate vegetables withered away, Orpine stood strong, leaves plump, green, alive. Its taste was sharp, astringent, but useful. In early spring and summer, the Vikings picked young leaves and shoots, eating them raw in small amounts or boiling them into soups. The flavor? Somewhere between sorrel and purslane. Tangy, slightly peppery. Not a feast, but a lifeline, and one rich in vitamin C and minerals. When other plants failed, Orpine persisted, and in that persistence it became sacred. Later folk traditions tied it to protection. In rural Scandinavia, pine was planted near doorways or on roofs to ward off fire and lightning, a symbolic echo of its physical role in protecting homes from the elements. Whether the Vikings believed that too, we can't be certain, but what we do know is that this plant was deliberately cultivated. Archaeologists have found orpine remnants near dwellings, pressed into clay, nestled in midden heaps where food waste accumulated, not as a weed, but as a survivor, a quiet witness to the rhythms of Norse life. A mother pulling orpine leaves from a wall crevice to feed her child, a father boiling it into stew during a dry spell, a healer pressing crushed leaves onto a wound, drawing on its anti-inflammatory magic. Because yes, orpine didn't just feed, it healed. Modern science has confirmed what Viking hands already knew. Orpine contains compounds that reduce inflammation, speed up healing, and support the immune system. In a world without antibiotics, that meant everything. But like so many of these plants, orpine faded, not because it failed, but because it couldn't compete with potatoes, with cabbage, with industrial food systems that demanded uniformity, high yields, and passive consumers. Orpine didn't offer that. It offered resilience. And resilience, it seems, went out of style. Today you'll find it in rock gardens, on green rooftops, in decorative succulent arrangements. Most people don't even know it's edible. Fewer still realize that it once stood between Viking families and starvation, that it turned stone into sustenance, that it turned a rooftop into a lifeline. But maybe, just maybe, it's time we remember. Not because we need to return to sod roofs and wooden bowls, but because the lessons they carried are still alive. That true strength grows where it's least expected. That survival doesn't always bloom in gardens. Sometimes it blooms in gravel, in shadow, in silence. And that in the end, the plants that save us may not be the ones we plant, but the ones we notice. The ones that grow without permission. The ones that wait for us to need them again. Not all Viking foods were born of the north. Some came from far away, not carried by raiders but by time, not stolen with sword but shared through soil. Alexander's was one such gift. A plant with roots in the warm sun of the Mediterranean and leaves that eventually flourished beneath cold Scandinavian skies. Its Latin name, Smyrnium olusatrum, hints at its ancient past. The Romans brought it north. Soldiers, merchants, settlers. And though empires fell and legions faded into the fog of history, Alexander's remained. The Vikings saw it growing wild in the ruins, and instead of ignoring it, they embraced it, because it made sense. In a world where winters were long and brutal, Alexander's was a miracle of timing. It was one of the first greens to rise after winter. Shoots emerged in early spring when snow still clung to the fields, and those shoots? Tender, nutritious, full of vitamin C, a medicine and a meal all in one. They could be eaten raw like wild asparagus, boiled, roasted, preserved. Its leaves, bitter but useful, added to broths, stews, or pounded into early sauces. The stems, hollow, aromatic, slightly spicy, peeled and eaten fresh or cooked. Even the seeds, sharp and peppery, were used as spice, long before blackwood became a luxury that the North could afford. But Alexander's was more than flavor. It was durable, a biennial that could self-seed, spread fast, and grow with little care. And that made it perfect for Viking gardens, especially in coastal regions where the soil was sandy, the wind salty, and other crops refused to cooperate. The Norse didn't reinvent it. They just recognized it. They observed, cultivated, made room for something useful, even if it didn't look native. Because that's the truth most people miss about Vikings. They weren't rigid, they were pragmatic. If a plant could help them survive, it didn't matter where it came from. And Alexander's helped. It provided year-round nutrition in coastal areas. Different parts of the plant matured at different times: roots in late fall, shoots in spring, leaves through summer, seeds in autumn. It was a calendar of food embedded in a single plant. So why did we forget it? What pushed Alexander's from our kitchens to the wild hedgerows where it now grows unnoticed, mistaken for cow parsley or just another weed? The answer, once again, is taste. In the 16th and 17th centuries, celery arrived, a newcomer with a milder, more delicate flavor. Europeans, especially the wealthy, fell in love with its elegance. Alexander's, bold and earthy, suddenly felt too wild, too rustic, and so it vanished from plates. By the 18th century, Alexander's had been pushed out, surviving only in monasteries, along stone walls, in the forgotten cracks between history and progress. But the plant itself never gave up. It still grows today, along coastlines, beside old roads, near ruins. It waits, like so many other forgotten foods, to be noticed again, not for nostalgia, but because its design is still brilliant. Sustainable, self-seeding, nutrient-rich, a food that doesn't need fertilizers, irrigation, or global supply chains. Just someone who's willing to ask, what is this? Why did we stop eating it? And what did we lose when we let it go? Alexander's is more than a relic. It's a reminder that food systems don't have to be complicated, that survival isn't always about conquest. Sometimes it's about listening to what the land is already telling you, and having the humility to keep what works, even if it wasn't yours to begin with. The Vikings knew that. That's why Alexander's, the Roman guest, became a northern citizen, not because of blood or borders, but because it belonged in the soil, in the kitchen, and in the quiet moments when the land and the people trusted each other. That kind of wisdom doesn't grow just anywhere, but when it does, we'd be foolish to forget it again. Some kings wear gold, others wear green. Not every throne is carved from stone. Some rise quietly from the dirt. In the Viking world, a world of scarcity, seasonality, and survival, good King Henry was more than a plant. It was a promise, a perennial patch of hope that returned each spring, right when it was needed most. While other crops still slept beneath the thawing earth, while barrels ran dry and preserved meats turned sour, good King Henry pushed its arrow-shaped leaves through snow melt and silence, declaring, "You've made it through the dark. I am your reward." It may not have looked like royalty. No bright flowers, no grand stature, just simple green leaves and inconspicuous buds. But what it lacked in glamour, it made up for in loyalty. Unlike annual crops that required planting, seeds, and prayers, good King Henry just came back. Year after year, no matter the frost, no matter the war. It grew near the hearth, near the longhouse kitchen, always within reach. And the Vikings knew exactly what to do with it. The young shoots, rising early in the season, were boiled like asparagus, one of the first fresh vegetables after months of salted, dried, and smoked survival. The leaves, rich in iron and calcium, were added to stews, folded into barley cakes, or eaten raw in small amounts. Even the buds, tiny and tight, were foraged and boiled, a Norseman's version of broccoli florets. Nothing wasted, everything used. And in a society where women bore the weight of continuity, good King Henry had a hidden role. It nourished the body after childbirth. Rich in blood-building minerals and vitamins, it was part of the postpartum diet in Viking homes. Not by theory, but by tradition. Passed down. Remembered. Protected. The Norse might not have spoken the language of biochemistry, but they spoke the language of observation. And they saw what good King Henry could do. It required almost nothing, thrived in the nitrogen-rich soils near compost pits, livestock areas, or kitchens. In a way, it was part of a Viking closed-loop system, taking nutrients from waste, turning them into nourishment again and again. What modern permaculturists now call regenerative design, the Vikings simply called life, and good King Henry was part of that cycle. But today, walk through a grocery store and you won't find it. Even in most gardens, it's unknown, mistaken for a weed, or left out of seed catalogs entirely. Why? Because it was replaced by spinach. Spinach, imported centuries later from the Arab world, offered a softer texture, a sweeter taste. but it also came with a price. Unlike Good King Henry, spinach must be replanted every year. It asks more, it gives less, but it won the popularity contest because our modern food systems stopped prioritizing resilience and started chasing refinement. We forgot that what grows easily and faithfully might be more valuable than what grows perfectly. We forgot the quiet kings. Today, Good King Henry survives mostly in heritage gardens, abandoned monastery plots, or as a naturalized plant growing near ruins, a green ghost of a time when food was local, seasonal, and sacred. But it's still there. And maybe that's the lesson, that not every king needs to be resurrected with fanfare. Some are just waiting, beneath the soil, beside the door, ready to rise again when we remember how to listen. Not because we're hungry for calories, but because we're starving for connection. Good King Henry reminds us that the strongest foods are often the humblest, that nutrition can grow without permission, right outside your home, and that true abundance doesn't come from control. It comes from trusting the land. That's what the Vikings understood. That's what Good King Henry gave. Not just greens, but a green flag that waved in spring, whispering, "You made it. I'm still here." Spring was the cruelest season, not because of frost, but because of false hope. After long, brutal winters, Viking families often found themselves in a dangerous place where winter stores had run dry, but the fields had not yet come alive. Hunger hanging in the air, quiet, desperate. And in that narrow, fragile window between the final sack of barley and the first sprout of grain, the Norse turned to something wild, something twisted. Bistort. Its name comes from Latin bistorta, meaning twice twisted, a nod to the gnarled, snake-like curve of its roots. Some called it snake plant, and like a serpent in the grass, it often went unnoticed until it was desperately needed. Bistort didn't grow in fields. It grew in the margins, the wet meadows, the stream banks, the acid soil too damp for wheat or barley. But those useless spaces, the Vikings saw value in them, because while the calendar crops failed in those lowlands, Bistort thrived. It became a kind of hunger gap hero. The first greens of spring were Bistort's long, lance-shaped leaves, rich in vitamin C, a sharp, earthy flavor, and a powerful ability to chase off scurvy and deficiency. They were boiled into pottages, mixed with other early greens, folded into hot stone-side porridges that warmed cold bellies. Its roots, harvested in late summer or autumn, were dried, ground, and stored, used to stretch flour when harvests were poor. It didn't just feed, it extended what little was left. You could take a few handfuls of barley meal, mix it with powdered Bistort root, and suddenly, a loaf, a meal, a chance. That's what Bistort was, a chance. Its value wasn't in beauty, its value was in its timing. And the Vikings, masters of seasonal living, understood that timing could mean life or death. They didn't grow Bistort like barley or beans. They managed it. They cleared competing vegetation. They protected patches near settlements. They transplanted roots closer to home, ensuring a steady supply when the snow began to melt and the pantry grew bare. It was a farming style we now call wild cultivation, working with nature, not against it. And it was brilliant because it turned overlooked landscapes into living insurance. But Bistort wasn't just food, it was medicine too. Modern science tells us what Viking healers had already sensed. Bistort contains powerful astringent compounds. It tightened wounds, treated diarrhea, stopped bleeding. When boiled into a thick tea, it helped treat internal inflammation. For a people with no hospitals, no pills, and no room for error, that mattered. And yet, like so many of its kind, Bistort slowly vanished, not in one moment, not in fire or famine, but gradually, as agriculture industrialized, as drainage projects turned wetlands into wheat fields. The places where Bistort grew began to disappear. And when the landscape changed, the knowledge went with it. By the medieval period, Bistort had become a folk remedy, a shadow of its former place in the Norse pantry. Today, it survives in the background, in gardens planted for decoration, in meadows protected by conservation laws, in old country recipes whispered across generations. But its story isn't just about food. It's about how the Vikings saw the land. They didn't ask, is this area fertile? They asked, what grows here anyway? They didn't try to force the earth to obey. They listened. They noticed that in wet meadows, Bistort flourished. So they adapted. That kind of wisdom doesn't require books. It requires attention. And attention is what we've lost. Today, our food systems are disconnected. We look for answers in plastic packages and imported goods, but the Vikings looked down into the mud, into the cracks, into the places others had written off, and there they found survival. Bistort is a plant that reminds us that strength doesn't always come from fertile ground. Sometimes it comes from resilience in the swamp, from knowing that when everything else is failing, something twisted and quiet and wild might just be your salvation. And in that moment, that bitter root becomes a feast, a savior, a memory with teeth. If you stood on a Viking shoreline, you wouldn't just see sea and sky. You'd see something stranger, a plant, growing where land forgot itself, in salt, in mud, in tide. A plant that looked like coral but lived above water, that crunched like a vegetable but tasted like the ocean. This was marsh samphire. Today you might find it on a fancy restaurant plate, drizzled with lemon oil, perched beside seared scallops. But for the Vikings, samphire wasn't garnish, it was survival. It grew where no other food dared, in the shifting edge, the in-between, where tide meets land, where fresh water mixes with salt, where nothing is promised and everything is tested. And yet samphire thrived. The Norse didn't cultivate it, they foraged it. They knew its cycles, when the stems were young and tender, when to pick, how much to leave behind. This was not agriculture. This was a relationship, a quiet rhythm between people and place. In summer, they harvested samphire, green, crunchy, salty, a rare source of fresh nutrients during seafaring months. In the kitchens, it was boiled quickly to soften the salt, eaten alongside dried fish, mixed into stews, and sometimes, more cleverly, fermented, packed in brine, stored in clay. The Vikings didn't know the word probiotic, but they knew a pickled plant could last through winter, that it could keep their guts strong, their bodies functioning, their children fed, even when the fields froze over. Nutritionally, samphire offered something no inland plant could: iodine, essential for thyroid health, essential for survival. Inland communities often suffered goiters, slow metabolism, stunted growth, but coastal Vikings, they had samphire, they had the sea, and in that briny, flooded world, they found a plant that gave more than it should have, and yet it asked nothing. No soil, no tilling, just patience and respect. The Norse gave both. They didn't overharvest, they didn't trample root systems, because they knew if you treat the shore like a pantry, not a battlefield, it will feed you. But like all stories in this series, Samphire's end came not through failure, but through forgetting. As salt marshes were drained, developed, turned into ports or farmland, Samphire's wild homes vanished, and with them, the memory. Its bold flavor, once appreciated, was called too much by modern palates. Its natural habitat was labeled wasteland, a zone to be conquered, not understood. Today, samphire has returned in a way, trendy, niche, gourmet, but it lives in glass jars and Instagram feeds, not in coastal food systems. And we've forgotten what it really was: a Viking pickle, not just a curiosity, but a strategic plant that turned unusable land into edible hope, that filled the gap between sea and soil and between hunger and health. And what does that say about us? That we overlooked such a gift, that we saw mud where the Norse saw a miracle. But maybe the plant hasn't given up. In certain quiet places, it still grows, uninvited but not unwelcome. Its stems still rise in saline air, still whispering to those who care to listen. I was here before you. I'll be here after. If you're hungry, I'm ready. Marsh samphire didn't just nourish the Vikings. It taught them this truth: that food doesn't have to be planted, that abundance doesn't have to be built. Sometimes the earth is already offering everything you need, if you have the humility to kneel in the mud and take it, with gratitude, with care, and just enough salt. Sometimes the most powerful things in history were never praised because they were stepped on. Burdock was one of them. Not glamorous, not rare, just a stubborn plant with massive leaves, hooked burrs, and a root buried deep in the earth, and in Viking life. Today, it's called a weed, an eyesore, something gardeners rip from the soil without a second thought. But for Norse families clinging to survival in the long Scandinavian winter, burdock wasn't a nuisance. It was a lifeline. Found near settlements, growing in disturbed soil, the very places most people ignore, it thrived where the land had been walked, worked, lived on. And that's fitting, because burdock wasn't a wilderness plant. It was a people's plant, The Vikings didn't just stumble upon it. Archaeological evidence shows they cultivated it deliberately. Seeds found in longhouse middens and storage pits suggest they knew this plant well, not just as medicine, but as food. The root, thick, long, and sweet when roasted, was a nutritional powerhouse, rich in inulin, a prebiotic fiber that supported gut health, packed with iron, manganese, and antioxidants. It was what you ate when the snow set in, when the barrels were empty, when you needed something that dug deeper than the cold. In Norse kitchens, burdock root was sliced, boiled into pottages, roasted in fire embers until caramelized, or dried and ground into flour to stretch bread in famine years. Even the leaves and stalks were eaten in spring. Bitter, yes, but full of minerals. It wasn't the main course, but it was there. And sometimes being there is the greatest act of service a plant can offer. The Vikings recognized that. In a world that didn't wait for you to recover from poor planning, burdock was part of their fail-safe, a root beneath their feet, quietly storing strength until the day it was needed. But perhaps the most fascinating thing, burdock didn't just feed, it healed. The Norse used its crushed roots in poultices to draw out infection. They steeped it into teas for inflammation, applied it to wounds. Everything, from its gritty root to its clinging burrs, served a purpose. Even the burrs themselves, notorious for sticking to clothing and fur, inspired the invention of Velcro 1,000 years later. The plant was practical genius growing in plain sight. So why did we forget it? Simple, it didn't fit. As agriculture became industrial, crops were judged not by resilience, but by yield. Burdock's roots are long, sometimes over 3 feet. They're hard to harvest with machines, and its taste, earthy, bold, too strange for modern palates. And so it was replaced by potatoes, by carrots, by convenience. But in Asia, burdock remains revered. In Japan, it's called gobo, and it's medicine, food, tradition. There, it was never forgotten. But in Europe, in the very lands where it once fed warriors and warmed the bellies of tired mothers, it became a ghost, still growing, still waiting, still carrying all the same nutrients, the same healing, the same quiet promise. But now, trampled, poisoned, burned. Because we forgot to ask one question before we called it a weed. What did it once do for us? And the answer is everything it could. Burdock's story isn't just about a root. It's about humility, about what we choose to preserve and what we let go of in the name of progress. The Vikings didn't care if a plant was pretty. They cared if it got them through winter, and burdock did. So maybe, just maybe, we should kneel down and look again at the plant we've called a pest and see it for what it really is, a survivor, a healer, a buried inheritance we're only just beginning to remember. It's still there, right beneath your feet, waiting for you to need it again. In the end, it wasn't just what the Vikings grew, it was what they could keep. Because survival wasn't just about what you could hunt or harvest, it was about what you could preserve. And in a world without refrigeration, without plastic, without pasteurization, preservation was power. And few plants gave the Vikings more power than bog myrtle, a low shrub, aromatic, resinous, modest, but deadly effective. It grew where few things dared, in bogs, in acidic wetlands, in between places most civilizations ignored. But the Norse, they didn't ignore it. They harvested it, protected it. They even shaped the land to encourage it, blocking streams to create the wet conditions bog myrtle loved. Because this wasn't just a plant. It was their spice cabinet, their refrigerator, their defense system, all wrapped in narrow, toothed leaves. Bog myrtle, or pors in Old Norse, was legendary for its preserving power. Its oils were antimicrobial. Its scent, sharp, sweet, slightly bitter, repelled insects, mold, and decay. The Vikings lined grain storage jars with its dried leaves. They rubbed it into meat and fish, smoked it into preservation fires, and brewed it into beer, not just for flavor, but for longevity. That's right. Before hops, bog myrtle was the Vikings' brewmaster's best friend. It flavored their mead, their ale, their sacred grog that warmed the bones in longhouses and celebrated the return of spring. It wasn't subtle, but it was strong, just like them. But like many strong things in history, it was eventually outlawed. As hops became standardized across Europe in the Middle Ages, bog myrtle fell out of favor, not because it failed, but because it wasn't consistent, not uniform enough, too wild, too regional, too alive. By the 16th century, brewing laws in many regions banned the use of bog myrtle altogether. a 1,000-year tradition erased by legislation. And slowly, the knowledge of what this little bog shrub could do, how it could preserve food, protect grain, keep sickness at bay, began to vanish. Today, bog myrtle still grows in northern wetlands. Its leaves still release that warm, earthy scent when crushed, but few stop to smell it. Fewer still remember its name, and yet it waits, a forgotten guardian, a quiet echo of a time when every plant had a purpose, and every purpose was earned by generations of trial, error, and respect. Because that's what this entire journey has been about. Not just food, but intimacy with the land. Bog myrtle didn't grow in manicured fields. It didn't fit rows. It didn't ask to be harvested. But when the Norse knelt beside a bog and smelled its oils rising from sun-warmed leaves, they knew. They'd found a keeper. Not a delicacy, not a luxury, a shield, one that could outlast rot, outlast winter, outlast time. So what does it say about us that we traded that kind of wisdom for convenience? That we forgot the plants that didn't just feed us, but protected what we had already worked so hard to earn? Bog myrtle reminds us that true abundance isn't just what we grow, it's what we can carry through the hard seasons, what we can preserve in root cellars, in traditions, in memory. And maybe that's where this story ends. In the wetlands, among the moss and reeds, where a small Viking plant still grows, waiting for someone to remember it not for its flavor, but for its function and its faithfulness. Because in the end, preservation isn't just about food. It's about honor, about not letting good things go to waste. Not in your pantry, not in your culture, not in your story. 12 plants, not crops of conquest, not emblems of empire, but roots, leaves, wild things, grown in the shadows of fjords, picked from cliffside cracks, stored in clay, whispered across generations. They didn't feed kings, they fed everyone else. The women who held communities together through winter, the elders who remembered when to dig and when to wait, the children who learned to recognize safety by scent. These plants, Angelica, Navu, scurvy, fat hen, sea kale, and all the rest, weren't just food. They were the threads of resilience. In a world that gave nothing for free, they gave everything. And today, we've forgotten them. Not because they failed, but because we stopped asking the question the Vikings once asked so well. What grows here? What survives? What still waits for us beneath the weeds in the cracks along the shorelines? Maybe the answer to the future isn't in the next superfood. Maybe it's in the old ones. The crops that don't need perfect soil, the plants that come back year after year, the flavors our ancestors trusted with their lives. We don't just inherit land, we inherit memory. And these plants, they are memory made edible. So let's not just remember them, let's revive them, let's talk about them, grow them, taste them again. Because if we don't, we risk losing not just food, but the part of us that knew how to live with the land, not just off it. The part that didn't wait for perfect conditions, but adapted, like sea kale on a salted shore, like burdock beneath our feet, like bog myrtle watching over what we dared to store. This is Viking history, not just the steel of the sword, but the soil beneath the blade, the real legacy of the North, hidden in roots, leaves, and forgotten flavors. If this story moved you, like the video, share it, leave a comment. Which plant do you think we should bring back? And if you're ready for more lost knowledge, more Viking truths buried in time, subscribe. This is just the beginning. The land still remembers, and together, so can we.